Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Church and Society webinar. Before we continue, if you are in need of ASL interpretation, please enter that request for services in the chat box. Our tech team will be happy to provide the interpreter screen for you. The focus of this webinar will be preventing criminalization and harm in schools. This is our third webinar in our Towards Educational Equity, Investing in the Beloved Community webinar series. We chose this topic because racial and gender inequalities show up in the classroom, creating trauma, discrimination, and unfair disciplinary practices. As United Methodists, we believe that all children deserve to be respected, safe, and treated as if they are truly of sacred worth. My name is Reverend Katie Monforte, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator at Church and Society. I'm grateful to be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Amy Hong, and our intern, Emily Newman. As we begin, we'll take a brief look at the schedule to see what we have planned for this webinar. We'll begin with a video, a part of the series of videos we've been showing in this webinar focused on criminalization and harm in schools. We will then meet our panelists, Sherry Dowdy and Krithika Santham. These panelists will be able to have a time of conversation, and this will help us unpack and highlight some of the issues and practices that are addressing criminalization and harm in our schools so that we can help prevent this. Then we will follow up with a question and answer segment led by our Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement, Amy Hong. Be sure to populate your questions in the Q&A feature found in the Zoom mechanisms. And then we'll finally close with announcements. So now I'd like to introduce Emily, who's here to introduce us to our video. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everyone. As Katie said, I'm the theological intern with the seminar program, and I'm really grateful to be here. So throughout this webinar series, we're showing videos from contributors who are students, teachers, school social workers, educators, many of whom are United Methodists themselves and are directly impacted by education policy on a daily basis. And they have answered questions we've provided about each of the topics for this morning. They will be addressing the ways that they've seen criminalization of students of color in their own experiences and how this kind of harm may be prevented. So thank you so much to our wonderful contributors for giving their time and energy to share their thoughts and voices with us. And we are excited to share this with you as we frame our discussion this morning. So here is the video.
In the past, I have witnessed children of color receiving harsher punishments and consequences, such as expulsion for behaviors that white children were not reprimanded for. For example, one year I had a Black student, a female student, who was expelled for aggressive behavior towards another student. She had some conflicts with others prior to the final incident. However, they were not addressed with behavioral plans or social and emotional counseling. Then the following year, I had another female student. She was a white student who repeatedly physically harmed other students. However, she was never expelled. Rather, she was provided counseling within school and outside of school. The inconsistency in following the school behavioral protocol is pretty appalling. These experiences repeat the narrative and stereotype that Black children are more aggressive or misbehaving. I think untrained educators are following the narrative that some children are more innocent or should be provided with more adult guidance rather than believing that all children need the loving support of an adult. Children of color are expected to know and behave properly in the classroom, and there is very little room for error.
In my opinion, school misconduct is often not appropriately handled. The role of school resource officers in the presence of police in schools is something that is actively harmful and detrimental to the growth of students, as the arrest of students on grounds of drug possession or schoolyard scuffles does not give them the room to learn and grow in their own morality and understanding of what is right and wrong. Instead, it punishes them and puts things on their record that will stunt their growth and actively work against them as they continue to learn and grow and make mistakes as young people in American society.
I think that the equity teams that have been started within schools in my district are a great starting point for having conversations about how students of color are adversely affected by systems in our society. But we have to dig deep and look at our own biases and how these continue to perpetuate the inequalities within our system and within our school.
At my current school, there is a part-time resource officer that comes a few times a year. And unfortunately, many of my students are afraid or nervous to be around the officer. Not because she is unfriendly towards the children. She's actually very kind and supportive of our school. However, the only experience that my students, many of who are undocumented, have been with local police outside of the school, and those experiences oftentimes have been very negative or traumatizing for our students. And so it is very challenging for our students to be comfortable around our resource officer.
We do have resource officers in our school, even though I don't think there are a lot. They did make me feel safe in 6th grade, but if we were still going to school right now, I feel like with everything going on, I feel like I would be a bit more uncomfortable seeing them due to all the Black deaths by racist officers.
It's incredibly important that we divert the funding that's being given to school resource officers and instead fund counselors who are able to teach students emotional intelligence and proper ways to know what's right and what's wrong, and how to better understand themselves and their own emotions so that they can avoid making mistakes that they're so often punished for and not given the chance to learn from.
We are so grateful for the contributors to this video. And now we will get to know our presenters a little bit more, learning about their work and background. Sherry Dowdy is the Senior Education Research Analyst at the Government Accountability Office, which is the independent research arm of the U.S. Congress. Her portfolio includes work around studying, examining issues of race, poverty, and disability status in public schools. Her published work has examined disparities in discipline, disparities in course offerings at high school and K through 12 schools. She also has studied K through 12 school shootings, resegregation of public schools, and restraint, seclusion, and in public schools. Kritika Santanam is a movement lawyer with the Advancement Project of the National Office, where she utilizes the abolitionist framework to provide strategic, legal, policy, and campaign development to support grassroots groups seeking to dismantle racist predatory practices within the criminal legal system and abolishing police and policing infrastructures in public schools. Prior to her current role, she was the associate at Arnold Porter K. Schooler LLP, where she maintained an active pro bono practice which was focused on educational justice and criminalization issues. Kritika got her start in public interest work as the Director of Youth Development at Legacy LA, a grassroots community-based nonprofit serving youth in East Los Angeles. While there, she helped create the organization's flagship youth leadership program, which provides critical race theory workshops, civil engagement opportunities, and community organizing training. This is all aimed to catalyze youth to become advocates in community development and to develop their capacity to create change within systems. We are grateful for the wealth of experience that these speakers bring with them and will offer to our webinar discussion. I also would like to take a moment to introduce Leo Yates and Brenda Kelly-Frey. Reverend Leo Yates is a deacon in full connection in the Baltimore Washington Conference. Besides being a licensed clinical professional counselor, he holds a national certification in sign language interpreting through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. He currently is appointed to the Division of Rehabilitation Services, where he primarily serves deaf and hard of hearing adults with disabilities. His secondary appointment is as the Disability Ministries Coordinator at Emmanuel UMC in Laurel, Maryland. Brenda Kelly-Frey has worked as an interpreter most of her life. Being born of hearing parents, she assumed the role of interpreter as a young child. She became a certified interpreter in 1976 and has interpreted for a variety of settings, which include religious, mental health, legal, education, and technical healthcare settings. Brenda taught at the Interpreter Training Program at Katsonville College, which is now known as the Community College of Baltimore County. After she retired in 2019, after working for over 20 years for the state of Maryland as the Director of Maryland Relay Services. Now she holds hours as a freelance interpreter and a grandmother of 4 beautiful grandchildren. She is also actively involved in advocating for civil rights for the deaf and hard of hearing community at the national and state level with a variety of organizations that serve the deaf and hard of hearing. Thank you both for providing ASL interpretation. We will now transition to the conversation with our panelists. Kritika, could you share with us what the Cradle to Prison Pipeline is and why it is a racial justice crisis?
Sure. So first off, good morning, everyone. Kritika Santhanam with Advancement Project, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of you today. So when we think of the school to prison pipeline, I like to best describe it as a system of laws, policies, and practices that directly and indirectly push students, and specifically students of color, LGBTQ students, and students with disabilities out of schools and onto a pathway that ends in incarceration. And at Advancement Project, we view the pipeline as both a civil rights and racial justice crisis. The various components of the school to prison pipeline, whether that's police presence in schools, zero tolerance discipline policies, or criminalizing age-appropriate adolescent behavior, all operate to target students of color and Black students specifically. Now, data released by the Department of Education's Civil Rights Data Collection for the 2015-2016 school year reveal, very clearly why this is a racial justice crisis. While Black students during that school year represented only about 15% of enrollment in public schools across the country, they accounted for 31% of students who were referred to law enforcement or arrested. And research shows that higher discipline rates for students of color, as we saw in the intro video, are not due to higher rates of misbehavior, but instead due to systemic racism. The Civil Rights Data Collection's most recent data for the 2017-2018 school year reinforces, again, why this is such a deeply entrenched issue. That data revealed that while Black students with disabilities comprised only 18% of the student population, they made up the 52% of students subjected to physical restraint and the 60% of students subjected to seclusion. So there really needs to be a deeper understanding, commitment, and investment to dismantling systemic racism that's just very deeply entrenched within our public education system.
Thank you. Next question is for you, Sherry. 30 years ago, Congress passed the Americans with Disability Act to give people with disabilities equal access to services like public education. However, the rate at which students with disabilities are being disciplined raises questions about equal access. Can you share with us the disparity in discipline students with disabilities receive in schools? And as a follow-up question, can you share about the disparity when race is added to the identity of the student?
Sure, and thank you everyone. And it's really good to be here to share my findings from research. Just as a way of background, in 2018, we published a study on discipline disparities in K-12 schools. And we did this study at the request of Congress. We too use the civil rights data, which is a very comprehensive source of information. That information is actually collected from every public school district in the country. And so the information is pretty robust. And so this is what we found. With respect to the 6 disciplinary actions the federal government collects, students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined across all of them. So what does that mean? So when it comes to out-of-school suspensions, in-school suspensions, expulsions, corporal punishment, referral to law enforcement, and arrest in schools, students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined. With respect to school poverty, these students were also disproportionately disciplined. And that means that regardless of the level of poverty, whether it was high poverty, low poverty, medium poverty, and everything in between, they were disproportionately disciplined. And then finally, when we looked at the type of public school students attend, students with disabilities were disproportionately disciplined in regular public schools, charter schools, magnet schools, alternative schools, and special education schools. So I'm going to throw in a couple more things about what we mean by disproportionate discipline. So students with disabilities make up about 12% of the public school students, but they were, at the time of our study, 27% of all students arrested in school, 27% of all students referred to law enforcement, and 24% of students expelled from school. Now, as to your follow-up question, being Black mattered majorly. As a matter of fact, we found that Blacks were disproportionately disciplined at higher rates than any group of students in schools. And so that was true for Black students as well as for students with disabilities. And so what did that mean? It meant, for example, that Black students in particular were disciplined as early as preschool. It also meant that even though there were 17 million more white students than Black students, 176,000 more Black students were suspended from school. And as you can see, it's a pretty pervasive problem when you look at it from various vantage points.
Thank you for highlighting the pervasive problem and for giving us the research to back that up. Krithika, according to the National Association of School Resource Officers, there's no accurate number of school resource officers in school because school resource officers are not required to register in any national database, nor are police departments or schools required to report school resource officers. Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of school resource officers? Like, why were they placed in public schools? And what is the impact of having police presence on students? How does this fuel criminalization and harm?
Sure. So Advancement Project, in collaboration with the Alliance for Educational Justice, released a fantastic report in 2018 titled We Came to Learn that brilliantly chronicles the history and origin of school policing, which people mistakenly believe was a response to mass school shootings. But in fact, what the data and research in this report reveals is that school policing originated as a way to suppress Black and Brown-led student movements for equity and educational justice. These students were organizing against racial discrimination in schools, demanding culturally responsive school curriculum and supportive school environments. And these movements were met with incredible repression from local, state, and the federal government, which all coordinated police strategies to suppress these movements. So I want to talk a little bit about the numbers, since you mentioned that there isn't really an accurate count. What we know from our research is that in 1975, roughly 1% of US schools reported having sworn law enforcement on school campuses. And by 2014, that percentage point jumped up to 24% of elementary schools and 42% of secondary schools having police presence on campus. And NASRO, which was founded in the early 90s, really started pushing this narrative of school resource officers, framing policing as a resource within schools. You know, let's have police be mentors, and let's have police be counselors, and let's have them be mental health specialists. And the problem is that has never been and never will be the role of police. And in fact, we can actually bring in trained professionals who go to school to get specialized degrees and undergo training to provide these types of services. But so the impact of NASRO and this messaging has resulted in an investment of roughly $2 billion in school policing from states and the federal government since 1999. And that in turn has created our present day reality where 1.6 million students in this country attend schools with police, but no school counselors. 3 million students attend schools with police, but no nurses. And 6 million students attend schools with police, but no school psychologists. And the students attending these schools are overwhelmingly students of color. The other thing that I want to be very clear about is that the same violence and brutality we see from police in our communities, on the streets, and what we've seen even just this summer is also happening on school campuses. Advancement Project has been documenting school-based police assaults, and we know that pre-COVID, these assaults were happening at approximately a rate of 1 per week. So the issue is, not only incredibly harmful, particularly for marginalized students, so students of color, Black students, students with disabilities, students with differing sexual identities, but it is also this rapid fire fuel towards criminalization, mass incarceration, expulsion, and really interrupting the opportunity and potential for students to have a successful life.
Wow, thank you for pointing us to the Research of Advancement Project and just showing the juxtaposition between the supports that students are lacking compared to how many resource officers are in our schools. Sherry, I would like to bring up a report that was from last June from NPR. They did a segment on a student in Fairfax County, Virginia, who had autism and behavioral issues. And this student was restrained or secluded more than 400 times. And the conclusion of this report shared that the student ended up hating school, becoming more violent, and really distrusting authority. What are seclusion rooms and how prevalent are they in K through 12 schools? Are they regulated and reported? Could you share a little bit more about this? Thanks.
Yeah, I also saw that NPR segment and was really troubled by its content. First of all, seclusion rooms are not reported in any federal data collection, which would make them difficult to regulate. Also, we do not know how prevalent seclusion rooms are. But based on my research, I know that they can look very, very different from school to school. I've seen some of those. In one school, the seclusion room was actually located within the classroom. And it was a very small padded room. And once in, the student would not be able to get out. I would definitely refer you to some of our research looking at restraint and seclusion, which contains several pictures of these seclusion rooms. The other thing I would really like to add, and I think this is a bigger issue, and the issue is that we really do not know how many children are restrained or secluded in school, or even the frequency. Even though this information is supposed to be reported from every school district in the nation to the federal government, we did a study earlier this year that found that these numbers are severely underreported. As an example, Fairfax County reported that it had not restrained or secluded any students in 15-16, which was the most recent year available for data.
Thank you. The next question is for both of you. Students of color, especially female students of color and students of color with disabilities, are often punished more harshly than white students. Can you speak to this discrepancy in punishment? What kind of punishments there are, and based on race, gender, and ableism? Krithika, if you could answer first, and then Sherry could add her insights too.
Let me unmute myself first. So the consistent pattern that we see is that the most marginalized students are subjected to the most punitive disciplinary policies, and they're also disproportionately criminalized and arrested. Now in DC alone, we know that Black girls are 30 times more likely to be arrested than white youth of any gender identity. And while Black students make up roughly 67% of the student population, they've made up more than 90% of out-of-school suspensions in each of the previous 3 school years. Again, that's specific to DC, but these are statistics that are prevalent all across the country. And I want to underscore a point that I made earlier, which is that these discrepancies and disparities are not due to higher rates of misbehavior, right? But they're instead due to how these systems, whether it's the public education system more broadly or policing more specifically, it's how these systems view students of color, LGBTQ students, and differently abled students in comparison to their white peers. And so, that is really an issue that demands a deeper level of analysis and understanding from both educators, school administrators, and the broader community at large, because it is so deeply entrenched in our public education system that I think even the most well-meaning educator may unintentionally be sort of fueling that fire if they're not understanding how responses and behavior, how responses to behavior, right, is being meted out based on the race, gender identity, or disability status of a particular student.
I would absolutely echo everything she just said, and also say that there are a host of reasons, like implicit bias, which you were just talking about. And these are stereotypes or unconscious associations teachers or staff may have that cause them to judge students' behavior differently based on who they are. Our report has some examples of them. For example, we talk about an example where for the same behavior, a white student got warnings or detention, and a Black student was sent to an alternative school where they were searched every day, had to be escorted by security guards, not allowed to carry a purse or a book bag. Another reason as it relates to students with disabilities is the inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion. According to federal guidance, restraint and seclusion should only be used when the student's behavior poses imminent danger to self or others. It's never to be used as a punishment. And yet that consistently happens. In our discipline report, we talked about an example of a student with disabilities who was disciplined harshly for non-dangerous behavior. Prone restraint was used on this student, and it was found to be severe, persistent, and pervasive. In particular, staff held this one student down, face down 92 times over a period of 11 months, with the longest duration being 93 minutes. But the examples or the reasons for restraining and secluding this student was for nonviolent reasons, such as, not following directions or pushing desks or ripping up assignments. The other thing I would add is that sometimes the discipline policies themselves may disadvantage particular groups. For example, we visited schools who were suspending students for not arriving to school on time. And that may really disadvantage, homeless students or highly mobile students who move around frequently.
Thank you both for kind of naming some of the systematic problems that need to be addressed, naming implicit biases that need to be worked on, and some of the, just a real life example of a student who's being punished so extremely and with such dangerous outcome. Another question for the both of you. What policies and practices could be put in place in schools to create an environment where discipline is more trauma-informed? So what are some of the alternatives to restraint and seclusion? What are alternative ways of student discipline? Sherry, if you could answer that first, it'd be helpful.
Yes, I'm going to tackle it with some very obvious ones. And one is really looking at your discipline policies or your behavior codes of conduct and seeing if there are some that disadvantage particular groups. For example, policies that suspend kids for showing up late for school, or policies that punish kids for how they look, whether it's their hair, the dress code, that sort of thing. Also, with respect to students with disabilities, I think it's really important to collect the data on restraint and seclusion, the incidents that are happening in the schools. In some of the school districts that we visited, they were actually using that data to change behavior. For example, by documenting the patterns of behavior for a particular student and the time of day that they were becoming triggered, they could get in front of that behavior and reduce the need to restrain and seclude. The other important thing about collecting data is it allows you to see patterns among different classrooms and certain teachers. And so if you're seeing that certain teachers or staff are restraining students or secluding students at a higher rate, you can intervene with more training in terms of de-escalation. And then some of the more obvious ones that you've probably already heard about and that can really turn around a school and in some cases eliminate the need for any sort of exclusionary discipline. And those are things like positive behavior interventions and supports, restorative justice, social emotional learning. All of these things sort of look at what's going on with the child in a very non-punitive way.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with everything that Sherry just shared. And I think one of the things definitely to highlight is how disciplinary policies may sometimes inherently disadvantage marginalized students. And we see this especially with Black girls when it comes to school dress codes. They're definitely disproportionately harmed by school dress codes, whether they're sent home from school for a violation and forced to miss class, shamed for wearing their natural hairstyles, or just subjected to, the trauma and discomfort of feeling uncomfortable in what they wear on a daily basis. And there's a really great report from the National Women's Law Center about how this issue in DC particularly impacts Black girls. But one of the things to also consider is sort of this intersection of racism and sexism and how girls of color, particularly Black girls, are often hypersexualized and viewed as being older than they are. And, as a result of that, what we see for both Black girls and Black boys is a presumed lack of innocence, which we're willing to freely ascribe to their white peers. But I also think that before we can even talk about policies and practices, we really need to start with the demanding a divestment from the money that's being spent on policing, on school policing, and a corresponding investment in the types of supports and resources, that actually produce safe, nurturing, and supportive school environments. And so those are things like investing in transformative justice practices, having violence interrupters on school campuses, training students in peer-to-peer mediation and conflict resolution, ensuring that there are schools that are well-resourced enough to provide therapists, counselors, social workers, nurses, right? All of the various components that can effectively address students' social emotional needs and produce real safety on school campuses. Because one of the things that I always like to underscore is by the time a student shows up to school with a weapon, it's already too late. At that point, what we're doing is pursuing a reactive and a reactionary approach to school safety, right? And that's been so much of the policy and framework around safety is reactionary. And the focus really needs to shift from that reactionary framework to preventative policies that are, evidentiary based and have been proven with tons of research to back it up, that these are the types of policies and resources that actually produce safe schools.
Thank you for naming those preventative policies, those more student affirming, and dare I say, like more transformative ways of working with our students. This is the final question for the both of you. Many of our participants are planning to meet with their federal legislators. Are there specific policies or legislative asks that you would invite them to take and ask of their representative? And then what other ways can we advocate for safe, equitable education for all? Krithika, if you could answer that first. Good.
Sure. So in terms of federal legislation, The Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act is a good piece of federal legislation that was recently introduced by Senator Murphy and Senator Warren. And one of the biggest things that it does is it seeks to end federal funding for school-based police, which is currently funded through the Department of Justice's COPS program. And that particular program has provided close to $1 billion in federal grants towards school policing. So not only does it seek to end that stream of funding, but it also provides incentives and resources for school districts to replace police with counselors, social workers, nurses, and mental health professionals. But I think outside of the federal legislative advocacy space, I would urge the participants who are tuning into today's webinar to also get involved locally. And in DC in particular, there is an incredible organization called Black Swan Academy, a Black youth-led organization that has been doing incredible work in DC and has a local campaign to remove police from public schools in DC. And so I urge you to check out their website. They have a petition that clearly lays out the need to remove police and also some of the demands that the young people are seeking, which are largely around mental health resources. And so there are a lot of ways for folks to get engaged and invested in the fight. I think the federal fight is important, but what we know is a lot of the decisions around having police in schools or even punitive disciplinary policies are happening at the local level, right? So it's about understanding if you're in a particular jurisdiction where you have an elected school board. Of course, here in DC, we have mayoral control of schools, but if you're in a particular jurisdiction where there is an elected school board, getting a sense of who the organizing partners and grassroots organizations are on the ground who are already waging the fight, and then what are ways showing up to a school board meeting to provide public through your own social media, or just having a conversation, right, with a family member or a friend to break down some of these myths around the need for police and policing infrastructure in public schools.
I'm going to be really brief just because of my position within the legislative branch. And so I'm going to shy away from answering the questions about legislative asks. I think that would just be inconsistent with our role in the legislative branch. But one thing I would say, and I think that this is important, and that is that you show up with data, fact-based data. Because I think once people are armed with data and the facts, that it can be a game changer. With that, so I'm just going to plug a little bit some of the work that we've been doing as a lot of the report change policy, in some cases, develop new programs to address these kinds of issues. And some of our work on discipline disparities has resulted in additional funding to address those kinds of issues. And so it's important to have, really good, robust facts, when you go out.
Thank you both for reminding us the importance of research, facts, the personal decisions and conversations we can be having to dismantle biases, and then also the policy and legislative asks that were presented. Thank you both for kind of highlighting and helping us unpack the harm and criminalization that is happening in our schools, and for giving us some insights on policy, practices, behaviors that can help prevent these injustices. Amy is going to follow up with some of the questions our participants may have been offering throughout this conversation.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you so much for our speakers, and thank you so much for the participants submitting questions. So here are a few questions that have come in, and this question can go to both of our panelists. Has there been a tracking of ICE activity on school campuses? Has there been an increase in detention on nearby school property?
So I can take a first stab. I mean, I know that some of the partners that Advancement Project works with are definitely focused on this issue and advocating around this issue. And we know that that is a real threat and a real concern. I unfortunately don't have hard data to share about an increased presence, but I would take an educated guess to say that that is very much part of this sort of broader framework entrenched within public schools. And I think, in the short introduction video, there was really great commentary around how students who are undocumented might feel showing up to school campuses and seeing a school resource officer there, and what that could do to their mental state and the trauma that it inflicts. To know that, that there is police presence on school campus, and it may threaten their, their safety in a lot of really detrimental ways.
Yeah, just to echo that, I'm not aware of any tracking. But I do know that in schools, it is a real issue. Some of the districts that we visited, some students were afraid to come to school, or even afraid to take advantage of financial aid or filling out the FAFSA, because they felt that, some of their family members might be tracked.
Thank you so much. Here's another question for the both of you. Since many students have been virtual learning and it may be too soon for any kind of thorough research analysis, are students of color being targeted during virtual learning as well? There was a story early in October of a 9-year-old Black boy that was suspended for showing a toy BB gun on camera.
Yeah, I'm not aware that there is any data being collected on that, but definitely that's a real problem when people are able to see into people's homes and make rash decisions, possibly based on what they're seeing on camera. One of the things that I do know about the online learning, we're actually doing some research in that area, is that disadvantaged children have been missing from class. And so the sense is that these students are going to continue to fall behind. And by missing, what I mean is that some kids are not showing up for online learning at all, which is also a problem. And in some cases, teachers, social workers cannot even find these kids, and they tend to be those kids on the margin, disadvantaged children, highly mobile children, homeless children.
Yeah, I think, echoing a lot of what Sherry just shared, what we do know is that students of color are surveilled and criminalized at much higher rates. And, this is a really big issue now that schools become virtual. And underscoring that issue is this tech divide, this racial tech divide that we see, where, there are students who may have to rely on school issued laptops. And a lot of those laptops come with very strict policies around social media monitoring. And we know that a lot of these social media monitoring policies are also in implementation disproportionately targeting students of color. And so we've heard, anecdotal stories from our partners on the ground of students who've had police show up to their home based on a Facebook post or Instagram post that they made. And so I imagine that in the wave of reports and data and research that's released in 2021 and 2022, this will be sort of a big issue. Because the Louisiana story is just one of a few examples that I myself have heard in this period of virtual learning of students of color, particularly being criminalized even as school is happening through Zoom.
Thank you so much. Another question, and I'll leave it up to whoever wants to answer this one, and both of you guys can. Can you share more about social emotional learning and how it has been effective in reducing the need for discipline on school campuses?
Sherry, did you want to start, or I can kick us off?
Yeah, I have to say I haven't done any research on that area, but just to define what we mean by social emotional learning, it basically enhances a student's ability to deal effectively and ethically with daily tasks and challenges. And SEL integrates the 5 core competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and reasonable decision-making. What I do know that is that in general, schools that have been able to use all of these different types of interventions are able to, in some cases, eliminate the need for exclusionary discipline altogether. And so there's been some success among certain school districts. In some cases, there are even districts or laws in place to tamp down on exclusionary discipline by employing these kinds of tools. I think that would be an area for further research and for the Government Accountability Office possibly, but we have not done a systematic look at how effective those things are across the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think, I definitely want to highlight the importance of social emotional learning, particularly for students who are struggling and for whom school performance has been poor. They're more likely to find learning a source of stress and anxiety. And that might manifest in different ways, from decreased motivation to decreased self-confidence, or even engagement and feeling connected in the classroom and in a school environment. And so I think it is absolutely an important framework that needs to be more broadly applied. But again, I think the approach has to be, if we're going to focus on social emotional learning for students, it's really great. But what are we going to be doing to make sure that educators and school administrators aren't then, interrupting some of the benefits that may be gained through social emotional learning practices through their own implicit bias, right? So I think there's a lot of anti-racist training that is deeply necessary, especially in school environments, but society at large. And so, the skills that we are developing in our children and our young people are only going to be effective if they are learning in schools that are supportive and nurturing, where the educational curriculum isn't Eurocentric, and we really have a liberatory educational environment. So I think, the emphasis needs to be both on what are the skills that we're instilling in students and young people, but what are the practices and training that administrators and educators and really anyone who comes into contact with a student on a day-to-day basis, what is the training that's being employed there so that some of these implicit biases and systemic biases aren't repeated and reinforced.
If I could just add to that, I think it's really key that that teachers and staff get training across these different ways of avoiding exclusionary discipline. And some of the work that we've done in the field, they may have implemented parts of it, or it could be that certain staff members are resistant to, these kinds of approaches because they're used to disciplining in the old way. And so I think that, making sure that everyone is on board, and sometimes that requires not only training, but a culture change within the schools.
Thank you so much. And this question actually kind of, as a follow-up to the answers that you both just provided, But this was submitted by a teacher looking for advice on what to do when they're caught between how to engage parents so that's to help students with disciplinary issues at school, and what to do when they feel a lack of support from administrators on how to deal or handle disciplinary issues in the classroom.
Yeah, I think, it's teachers are really in a tough spot, especially because there just really haven't been the type of continued investment in public school, in the public school system and in public education that we need to ensure that teachers are also feeling supported on school campuses. When you're managing, a classroom of 30 to 40 students who may all have various needs and may be dealing with a lot of trauma due to being high risk, that is a lot to put on a single educator to say, okay, here, wave your magic wand and fix this. And so I think it's really important for that reason for educators to particularly be involved to the extent that they're able to do so based on, their union with local advocacy, right? Because a lot of the demands, for example, I lifted up Black Swan Academy as an incredible DC-based organization, and I had the opportunity to do a webinar with them for the Washington Teachers Union. And what you find in terms of a lot of the local fights to remove SROs and police presence from schools is that the demands in investment and resources that are being sought not just to benefit students, but also to benefit educators. And so there's a lot of alignment there in the fight. And it's important for educators to get involved and engaged in the fight because you're seeking, the same thing and the end goal is the same. And a lot of times, if you're finding that you don't have that institutional support from school administrators, then public pressure, right, can be a really important tool in your tool belt, whether that's an organized group of students or an organized group of parents or the community at large saying, hey, we demand a different type of framework for our children and our young people. And we demand the type of investment in resources that we historically have not seen.
Yeah, I would just echo that and also say that it sounds like that person is caught between a rock and a hard place because real change does happen from the top down. But the only thing that I would add is, having good data to show the success of whatever intervention you're trying to achieve is always important.
Thank you. Here's another question. What do school resource officers do besides policing?
Well,
I would be, oh, sorry, Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah, I know you'll have a lot to say on this. I've actually visited schools around the country, and let me first say that there are things that they should not be doing, and that is they should not be involved in disciplining children and students. And we know that for a fact that they are. Discipline should be the responsibility of the school, not of a police officer. So that's one thing. But we have visited some schools where the SRO is actually also a counselor, and definitely had a pulse on what was happening in the larger community. And so if there was gang violence that kicked off over the weekend, a student might feel really comfortable going to, that person who's the SRO / counselor and letting them know, that something happened. And so in that way, they can be very, very useful. The other thing I just want to add, because the presence of SROs is really a really important issue. And I'm not sure if people are aware that not only are there SROs in schools, there are also school districts that have their own police force, with, cars and, and an office right there at a particular school. And so, having them there, that presence can be both a help and also very overwhelming and scary for students.
Yeah, I think the 2 cents that I would add is, at Advancement Project, we are explicit about our position that there is no place for any type of police presence on school campuses. And a lot of what we do in our work is point out that this slash, right, of like SRO but counselor, SRO but mentor shouldn't exist, because there are trained professionals who have gone to school to get a degree in counseling, who understand what that work looks like in a way where we shouldn't be having police officers wear these different hats. With that said, there are of course going to be individual officers or even school security guards who may have very close relationships with students and may be functioning as a de facto mentor to, a certain group of students. But I think the problem is when we start to take our focus off of the very system of policing and focus instead on individual good and bad apples, right? Because any industry, you're going to have exceptions. And you're going to have folks that are quote unquote good apples and folks that are quote unquote bad apples. But ultimately our position is that SROs inherently have the ability to police, criminalize, and use force against students. And so the benevolence of a particular officer in choosing not to do that doesn't erase the very real systemic threat and power, right, that accompanies that position, which is why we are very explicit in saying that there is no place for them on school campuses. And we really need to radically rethink our current framework for public education. And, this pandemic, I think, has caused many of us to reflect on a lot of things. And given that school is virtual and school districts are scrambling to figure out what reopening in a safe way is going to look like, or even what school itself is going to look like in 2021 and the years to follow, now is a very much a defining moment to rethink the presence of policing infrastructure in our public schools and to really ask, who is this system serving and who is it harming?
Thank you both so much for your answers. And this will be the last question as we, considering the time. What can churches, the community do to advocate for children who are targeted by school administration, SROs? Do you see any models that are out there that are making a positive impact?
So, and I'm sorry, I just want to clarify, Amy, the question was, what can communities do? Is that right?
Yeah, communities and churches, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this webinar is a fantastic example, of what I hope, other churches follow suit in doing, which is the political education, right, and information sort of gathering that is just so important. Because it's important for folks to not only be engaged and invested in the fight, but to understand what it is you're fighting for and what it is you're fighting against and why that is the case. And so a lot of our work with everything being virtual since the pandemic has been focused on political education and bringing parents and educators and other folks into the fight. So I think that is a hugely helpful starting point. And then, I'm going to reiterate what I've been mentioning throughout, which is that there are already local fights underway that folks can get involved in. One of the things that we have seen this summer, and it was always our understanding that the removal of police presence from schools was one of those things where we just needed one school district to take that first step for other school districts to follow, right? Because folks always want to see someone doing it first and know that it can be done. And so in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, when the Minneapolis school district, voided its contract with the school police department, that was a domino effect that led to several other school districts either terminating their school policing contracts or disbanding their own internal school police departments. And so what the next stage of the fight looks like in a lot of places is, what is implementation look like, and how do we get the resources and investments in place to ensure safety and supportive school environments without the presence of police, although I would argue that the presence of police never contributed to either. But so really being involved and engaged in local fights and understanding what's happening at a local grassroots level, I think is also key, along with political education.
The only other thing I would add is know your rights, you know, and the other thing is understand the resources that are available in your community that can help you with your fight. For example, protection and advocacy agencies are located in every state that you can go to for assistance and help. And so it's important to just canvass your community and know what resources are available to you. The other thing is that, you know, there are 2 federal departments that deal with issues of discrimination, civil rights discrimination, and they are the Departments of Education and Justice. To the extent that you are confronted with an issue that looks and smells like discrimination, there is a vehicle for addressing those concerns.
Thank you so much for answering those questions from our participants. Back to you, Katie.
We're grateful for the expertise and the experience, the work that our panelists have been able to offer throughout this conversation and through our questions. As we come to a close, I just want to remind those who are watching that if they want to share this content, this really important conversation with others, they can visit our UMC Justice YouTube page, and the recording can be accessed there so that you can share and keep this information going around so that more of us can be informed to take action. And then if you haven't already yet registered for our School in the Time of COVID-19 webinar, some of the questions that you all were asking will be specifically answered during that webinar later today at 3 p.m. So there's still time to register if you'd like to be a part of that conversation. And finally, I want to thank you all, the participants, for participating in today's webinar and making the conversation be so informative. Thank you for the questions asked, and our hope is that this conversation will continue to move you to invest in the beloved community that our education systems need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.